What if everything you thought you knew about death was just a beautiful distraction? What if the real mystery wasn't what happens after, but who's waiting when it does? I never thought I'd be the one asking those questions. My name is Adrian Wells. I'm not spiritual. I've never believed in miracles, never chased signs, never tried to decode the stars. I'm a construction superintendent from Seattle. My life was built on deadlines and blueprints, on numbers and structure uncertainty. I believed in the tangible, in tools not prayers, in logic not light. But then came the week of my son's wedding, and with it a near-death experience that didn't just interrupt my life, it unraveled everything I thought was real. It started with a stomachache, just an annoying little pain, while tossing a baseball with my younger boys at a park near our hotel in Santa Barbara. That was Wednesday. By nightfall, I felt nauseous. Thursday came with a low-grade fever. By Friday, my skin was clammy, my energy fading like mist at sunrise. I still smiled through the rehearsal dinner, pretending it was nothing, joking about getting sick at the worst possible time. But deep inside, I knew something wasn't right. My body was shutting down quietly. Saturday should have been celebration. Instead, just hours after the ceremony, I finally gave in. My fever was 104.3. I staggered into the emergency room, barely upright. When the nurse tapped my foot, I screamed. They moved fast. Scans, alarms, a flurry of hands. The verdict came quick: ruptured appendix, likely days ago. Sepsis was spreading. My blood was poisoned, and time I no longer owned it. They rushed me into surgery. The fluorescent hallway blinked overhead like a memory unraveling in reverse. I remember trying to say something to my wife, just one word, but the effort caught in my throat like unfinished business. The air inside the operating room didn't just feel sterile, it felt ancient. Time stopped, the world blurred. I was laying there 1 second, and then suddenly I wasn't. I was somewhere else. There, standing beside me, was a man, not a surgeon, not a nurse, not even a dream. A man who carried stillness with him, who seemed to still time with his very presence. He wore a simple white robe that shimmered like breath. His skin was bronze. His hair was long and wavy, but it was his eyes that took me apart, green, blue, endless, and knowing. They didn't just look at me. They looked through me, through the body, the thoughts, the life I'd lived, through the pain, through the pretending. I tried to speak, but no sound came. And yet I was more awake than I'd ever been. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't sedated. I had entered a state more real than reality itself. This was something beyond consciousness, beyond form, a true near-death experience that stripped away every illusion I ever clung to. He extended his hand and said gently, "I'm here to answer your prayer." That's when it hit me. I hadn't prayed in years. But then from some forgotten part of my soul, the memory rose like incense. I was 9 years old, at my grandmother's funeral. Standing in silence, eyes lifted, and I whispered, "God, I want to see what she sees." A child's whisper, lost to time, but not to the divine. I reached for his hand, and in that instant, the hospital vanished. The room, the lights, the table gone. I stood barefoot on a hill of impossibly soft grass blades, so detailed I could feel each one pressing into my skin like a welcome. The air was white but not empty, full, a presence disguised as light. I looked down. I still wore the hospital gown, but the world I stood in now was vibrant beyond language. Then the light came. From my right it began to rise, rays of pure energy floating like breath turned to form. One beam moved past my head, another gently touched my forehead. It didn't make a sound in my ears, but I heard it in my soul, a quiet hum that melted the cold that had gripped me for days. Suddenly, I wasn't afraid. I was wrapped in warmth, not of temperature, but of recognition, of being fully seen. Then the veil lifted. The whiteness pulled apart like curtains revealing a stage, and what I saw stole whatever breath I might have had. Flowers bloomed below, lavender, peach, soft crimson. They swayed though no wind moved. And beyond them, in the heart of a glowing valley, I saw a city. A city not built by hands but by purpose. Golden domes shimmered through mist. Towers stretched like prayers toward a sky exploding with color. Violet, tangerine, rose, sapphire light layered like music. Behind the city rose a mountain robed in trees formed from sacred geometry. And above it all, the sky pulsed not with clouds or weather, but with presence, with knowing. I didn't want to leave. I didn't even think to ask what this place was. I already knew. I knew in my bones whatever I was now made of. This was the other side, the true side. This was the heaven I hadn't believed in, the home I didn't know I missed. And the man beside me, he didn't need to say his name. I knew, Jesus, not in dogma, not in image, but in presence, in truth. I wanted to stay. I wanted to ask, but the moment that desire formed, the light began to recede. The colors faded, the warmth pulled away, and then like a thunderclap through my chest, I was jolted back. My eyes flew open. The operating room spun into view. A doctor leaned over me and asked, "Do you know your name?" My mouth was dry. My voice cracked. "Adrian," I whispered. The doctor nodded. "He's back." But I wasn't just back. I had crossed the veil. I had stood on holy ground. I had seen a city made not of stone, but of love. And I knew deep in my spirit that this wasn't just a near-death experience. This was a homecoming, and nothing would ever be the same again. When I opened my eyes, the world felt wrong. The ceiling above me was sterile and flat, framed by flickering, fluorescent lights, and the air smelled of chemicals and cotton. My throat burned, my skin was cold, and I couldn't move without effort. It felt like I had come back into a body that didn't belong to me anymore, like I was renting it temporarily. I couldn't tell what was real, what had just happened, or how to hold on to the memory of where I had just been. All I knew was that I was back in the hospital, surrounded by machines and strangers in blue scrubs, but something inside me knew I had just come from somewhere else entirely, somewhere sacred. I had just returned from a near-death experience so vivid, so alive, that this world now seemed dull and distant in comparison. They wheeled me down a hallway toward the ICU, and as I looked around, everything felt smaller, dimmer. The walls were white, the floors were clean, but the atmosphere lacked what I had just touched. There was no music in the air, no grass beneath my feet, no light that spoke in silence, just the cold clatter of hospital routine and the beeping of machines that had no idea I had stood on the edge of something eternal. I tried to remember every detail of my near-death experience. The hill, the flowers, the light that moved like breath, the man with knowing eyes. But the harder I tried, the more the memories scattered like dust in sunlight. I drifted in and out of sleep, tethered to IV lines and monitors. Every time I opened my eyes, I hoped to see the mountain, to feel that warmth from within, to sense the presence I had just stood beside. But all I found were plastic curtains, nurses adjusting machines, and doctors checking charts. The contrast between the divine and the ordinary was almost unbearable. The silence here wasn't peaceful, it was hollow. My body ached, but my soul ached more. Not from trauma, but from absence. I hadn't come back afraid. I had come back longing. When the surgeon finally came in the next morning, his voice was calm, but carried something underneath it. Hesitation, maybe reverence. He checked the surgical site, pressed gently on my abdomen, and said, "You were septic. Appendix ruptured days ago. You're lucky." Then he looked at me more seriously. "We've seen worse cases, but they didn't survive. You did. That's saying something." I wanted to tell him everything. That I had crossed into a different realm. That I had experienced a near-death experience unlike anything I had ever imagined. That I had met someone who didn't need to speak, who knew me without asking. But the words wouldn't form. There was no language for what I'd seen. So I just nodded and he nodded back, and I wondered if he saw it in my eyes, if he'd ever stood at that veil himself and recognized the look of someone who had returned. My wife arrived that afternoon, her face swollen from crying, her voice soft and trembling. She held my hand and asked how I felt. I tried to answer, but something cracked in me. I broke down, not from fear, not from physical pain, but from the weight of what I had seen. The tears weren't weakness, they were memory trying to surface. I tried again the next day, and again I cried. On the third day, I finally spoke, and the words felt like confession. "I saw him," I whispered. "I saw the light. I saw a city." Her hands covered her mouth and her eyes filled instantly, not because she was shocked, but because something deep inside her had always believed it was possible. She didn't ask for proof. She didn't need logic. She saw the truth in me. The days that followed didn't feel like recovery. They felt like initiation. Each walk down the hallway with my IV stand wasn't just physical therapy, it was a quiet prayer. The near-death experience stayed with me not as a vision I could recall at will, but as a presence that hovered just beneath everything. Even the hospital walls seemed to shimmer faintly. The near-death experience didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. I wasn't trying to get back to normal. I didn't want to, because normal had never shown me the face of eternity. One afternoon, I stopped in front of a framed photograph in the hallway, just a stock image of a beach at dusk. But something in the lighting and the way the waves faded into the horizon pulled at me. It was almost there. Almost the right color, almost the right warmth. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring not at the picture, but at the memory just behind it. The veil felt thin again. I could feel the afterglow of the place I had seen during my near-death experience. And for a moment, the hospital didn't feel quite so far from heaven. Even something as simple as eating changed me. The first banana I ate after 6 days of fasting brought me to tears. It wasn't just a fruit, it was creation. It was sunlight, water, soil journey, and now grace. That banana had traveled through time and space to reach the body of a man who had technically died. I didn't just eat it, I honored it. I cried over it. Not because I was fragile, but because I finally understood what it meant to receive. Everything had meaning now. Every bite, every breath, every glance. The world hadn't changed, but my eyes had. People said I was brave. They didn't know the truth. I wasn't brave, I was broken open. And in that brokenness, something holy had poured in. I no longer walked with the same steps. I no longer looked with the same eyes. Each evening, I would close my eyes and try to return not to escape, but to remember. I would walk down that hill in my mind, feel the blades of grass, wait for the light to find me again. I wondered how many others had crossed the threshold like I had, how many had returned from a near-death experience, but stayed silent not because they forgot, but because they didn't know how to speak of something so real in a world that forgets. Eventually, the fever left me. The pain eased. The doctor said I could go home. They gave me paperwork, prescriptions, reminders, but no one gave me instructions for what to do after touching eternity. There is no handbook for returning from a near-death experience. There is no pamphlet titled How to Be Human Again After Seeing Heaven. When I walked out of that hospital, it wasn't weakness that slowed my steps. It was reverence. The trees, the cracks in the pavement, the way sunlight hit the hood of the car, they all shimmered with meaning. I was no longer afraid of dying. But more importantly, I was no longer asleep in life. Coming home didn't feel like coming back. There were no balloons, no cheering, just a quiet car ride with my wife driving slowly, avoiding bumps that might jolt my healing abdomen. My kids tried not to ask too many questions, and I didn't know how to give answers, even if they had. I wasn't just recovering from surgery, I was recovering from a near-death experience that had torn the veil between two worlds. And now I was caught in the strange space between memory and presence, trying to make this life feel real again. Even the air at home felt different. Not sterile like the hospital, but somehow thinner. The walls felt like paper. The furniture was familiar but distant. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared out the window for what must have been hours, not because the view was anything special, but because the rustling of a tree in the breeze stirred something I couldn't name. It reminded me of the way the flowers had moved on that hill, alive, intelligent, intentional. In the quiet, I kept asking myself if I had imagined the entire thing. But no, it was too real. The near-death experience wasn't a dream. It was a return to something I had always known, but forgotten. The next morning, I asked for something simple, a banana. It might have seemed like nothing to anyone else, but for me, it felt like a ceremony. I hadn't eaten solid food in nearly 2 weeks, and something about the color, the texture, the earth-grown reality of fruit drew me in. When my wife handed it to me, I held it with trembling fingers, not from weakness, but from reverence. It felt sacred. I stared at it like it was a gift from another world. The peel, the scent, the curve of its form, suddenly I saw the entire journey of that fruit. The soil that grew it, the tree that bore it, the sunlight that warmed it, the hands that harvested it, and the roads it traveled to land in mine. I peeled it slowly, like I was unwrapping a holy relic. And when I took the first bite, I wept. Not because I was emotional, not because I was fragile, but because I was aware, fully painfully aware, that even this ordinary act was extraordinary. That in this small piece of nourishment, life itself was whispering back to me. That banana wasn't just food, it was theology. It was the continuation of what I'd felt during my near-death experience, that everything, absolutely everything, is speaking, humming, vibrating with divine intention. Even potassium, even pulp. My wife didn't interrupt. She just sat across from me, silently watching, her eyes soft, her presence solid. She didn't ask me what I was feeling because I think she already knew. She could see it in the way I held things now, in the way I breathed. The days that followed felt like walking through molasses. The world around me moved at its normal pace. Emails, notifications, deliveries, but I had slowed down. My body was healing, yes, but my soul had changed speed entirely. Sounds felt louder. Colors looked deeper. Even my phone felt like a stranger in my hand. People texted to check in, sent memes, offered to visit. I didn't respond. I didn't know how to explain that I had stood in a city made of presence, that I had been enveloped in a light that knew my name, that I had gone through a near-death experience so profound, it made this reality feel like a faded photocopy of something greater. I tried writing it down. I sat with a notebook and pen, hoping I could capture the details, the way the grass felt under my feet, how the light moved like intention, how silence carried emotion. But the words fell flat. Every sentence felt like a betrayal. Every metaphor felt small. I tore out pages. I tried again. I failed again. How do you write about a place where love isn't said, but is? How do you describe a light that thinks, a breeze that remembers you? One morning I went for a walk, just around the block, just to move. I walked like a man rediscovering gravity. Everything I passed shimmered with memory, the neighbor's roses, the old tree by the corner, even the crack in the sidewalk. The sunlight filtering through the trees stopped me mid-step. I tilted my head, watching the golden beams shift through the leaves, and for a moment, I forgot where I was. I wasn't just seeing light, I was feeling it, drinking it, remembering it. It felt like the same light that had touched my forehead in the near-death experience. And I stood there, not moving, not thinking, just receiving. That same afternoon, I noticed a sparrow on the power line. It tilted its head toward me, and I felt as if it was asking a question without sound. Do you see now? And I did. I saw the layers, the hidden, the holy. The divine was not elsewhere. It was here, woven into the cracks of this world, waiting for someone to look closely enough. So I started taking photos. Not like a photographer, like a pilgrim. I photographed petals on the ground, chipped paint on fences, my wife's hand resting on her coffee mug. I filled my phone with the ordinary made sacred. My kids thought it was weird at first. Dad's into flowers now, they joked. But they saw it too, that something in me had shifted. I wasn't weakened, I was awakened. I stopped multitasking, I stopped rushing. I began to measure my life not by accomplishment, but by presence. When I spoke, I gave space between words. When I listened, I looked into eyes. When I hugged my daughter, I stayed longer. I didn't just want her to feel safe. I wanted her to feel seen. The memory of the near-death experience didn't fade. It embedded. Not as a story, but as a vibration. A hum beneath everything I did. It lived in how I washed my hands, in how I bit into an apple, in how I watched steam rise from my tea. I couldn't see the city anymore, but I could still feel it. Its echo lived in me. People started asking what changed me. Was it the surgery? Was it the pain? Was it the fear of dying? But the answer was none of those. What changed me wasn't death. It was what came after. The love, the presence, the knowing. The hand that reached for mine without asking anything in return. I had come back different. Not because I had seen something far away, but because I realized it was never far. Heaven wasn't distant. It was layered into everything. And a near-death experience wasn't just a detour from life. It was a doorway into a deeper one. So I moved slower now, not because I was weak, but because I was finally awake. I noticed how children looked at clouds, how old couples touched without words, how a stranger's laugh in a cafe could sound like a hymn if I listened close enough. I no longer searched for signs. I had become one. There were nights I couldn't sleep, not because of discomfort or painkillers, but because the air around me felt charged, like something was waiting just beyond the edges of perception. The house would be still, the moonlight curling gently across the ceiling, and in that fragile silence, I'd feel at the pull of the city I had seen during my near-death experience. It wasn't a memory, it was a presence. Not gone, just veiled. It wasn't behind me, it was beside me. That city had not disappeared. It had settled beneath the skin of the world, and in those quiet hours, I could almost sense its golden outline overlapping with this one. I didn't know how to explain it. I just knew I hadn't left it behind. It had followed me back, so I started to draw. I'm not an artist. I never had a passion for sketching, never studied composition or light, but something about this near-death experience refused to live in words, so I let my hands speak instead. I bought a cheap sketch pad, and each morning before the world stirred, I sat at the table and let the pencil move. I started with the hill, the breathing grass, the way it seemed to pulse with quiet knowing. Then the flowers, those impossible colors that swayed in stillness. But the more I drew, the more something unexpected began to emerge. Domes, spires, archways of light, the city, the same one from my near-death experience. The same one that opened itself to me without explanation, without demand. It began to return through lines and curves. Not imagined, remembered. It felt like I wasn't creating the sketches, but recovering them. My hands knew what my mind was still too stunned to articulate. The towers reached not towards sky, but towards soul. The rooftops weren't structures, they were songs frozen into form. Every stroke on the page felt like a sacred act of remembering. One morning, long before anyone else was awake, I walked to the small neighborhood park near our home. It was a place I'd passed by hundreds of times before, always too busy to stop. But now everything had changed. I found a quiet bench that faced the rising sun and sat with my sketchbook in my lap. Birds moved through the trees above, slicing the light into soft ribbons that fell across the grass like blessings. I opened the sketchbook to one of the drawings, the domes half buried in mist, the valley softly aglow, and I whispered, "I remember." And right then a breeze moved through the trees, not loud, not cold, just enough to rustle the leaves like an answer. It felt like someone was listening, like someone was there. I started returning to that bench every morning, not to draw, just to be. I'd sit there with my sketchbook in my hands, waiting not for visions or voices, but for stillness. And the stillness always came. Sometimes I would close my eyes and feel the grass again, the warmth, the silence, the way the air in that city didn't just fill your lungs, it filled your being. Other times I would simply stare at the way light moved across the trees, and for a moment, the veil between this world and that one felt paper thin. One afternoon, an older man sat down beside me on the bench. He didn't say anything at first, just sat quietly like he was waiting to. After a while, he pointed at the sketchbook in my lap and asked, "Is that a real place?" I hesitated, then said quietly, "I saw it once, when I died." He didn't blink, didn't laugh. He just nodded, slowly turned back to the trees and said, "Me too." We didn't talk after that. We didn't need to. The silence between us was sacred, full of recognition. Two people who had crossed the same invisible threshold and returned, each carrying a piece of it in their chest. It wasn't a conversation. It was communion. And for the first time since my near-death experience, I realized I wasn't alone. That encounter changed me again. I had spent weeks wondering if the city had only been meant for me, if it had been a personal message or a singular gift. But now I saw it differently. The city wasn't just mine, it wasn't behind me. I was behind the veil. I had been the one asleep. The near-death experience hadn't taken me away from reality, it had returned me to it. Everything I thought was solid had been illusion, and everything I thought was metaphor turned out to be more real than stone. All my life I had assumed that this world was the only one, that what I could see, touch, and control was the truth. But now I knew reality wasn't singular. It was layered, and the veil wasn't between life and death. It was between awareness and forgetting. The city had never left me. It had only waited for me to remember. That night I stood barefoot in my backyard under the stars. I looked up at the sky, and it no longer felt like distance. It felt like a door, like something waiting just behind the dark. I whispered again, "I remember." And something inside me lit up, not like a thought, but like a flame. The kind of light you don't see with your eyes, but feel with your soul. I didn't rush back to work, not because I couldn't, but because I wouldn't. Not yet. Not until I'd fully absorbed what had been given to me. I spent more time with my children, not lecturing them, not fixing things, but being present. I watched the way their eyes danced when they laughed. I listened when they didn't have words. I held them longer when they hugged me. I wasn't trying to teach them anything. I was just trying to remember with them, to remind them even without saying it that life was layered, that every moment was a doorway. One night my daughter asked, "Dad, what did you see when you died?" I paused for a long time. Then I said I saw a city, but it wasn't made of buildings. It was made of love. She tilted her head, curious. Was it scary? No. I said, my voice catching in my throat. It was home. I didn't explain further. I didn't need to. Sometimes truth doesn't need explanation. It just needs to be held. The near-death experience wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning, a compass, a memory of what has always been true, that we are not just bodies, not just names and roles and tasks. We are echoes of something eternal. We are light wrapped in skin, and the city, it was never somewhere far away. It was always waiting just behind the veil. The days didn't feel like recovery. They felt like rediscovery. Every morning I woke to a world that looked the same, but somehow wasn't. My house, my kitchen, my street, they all remained in place. But I was moving through them differently, like someone reading a story they used to live inside. The near-death experience had changed something fundamental in me. I wasn't chasing signs or miracles. I wasn't trying to hold on to the city or the hill or even the light. I was simply living with the echo of it in everything. There was a hum inside me now. Not an actual sound, but a vibration that existed beneath thought. It was most noticeable in stillness. When I stood at the sink watching water pour over my hands. When I sat quietly before the sun rose. When I inhaled the scent of my daughter's hair. It was there, always there, that gentle shimmer just behind my awareness. A presence that didn't announce itself, but made itself known. It felt like a light inside me. Not metaphorical, actual, subtle, yes, but intelligent, aware. Whenever I closed my eyes, especially during those early dawn hours, I would feel it waiting, not outside of me, but within. It wasn't trying to control me. It wasn't judging me. It simply observed. And in its presence, I felt seen in a way no human glance had ever achieved. That light knew everything. Not just my past or my fears or my private regrets. It knew me beyond what I knew of myself. It was the same light from my near-death experience, the one that had touched my forehead and melted every shadow I'd carried. It hadn't left me when I came back. It had come with me, and now it lingered like a quiet guide, never interrupting, but always inviting. In its presence, old memories began to surface. Things I had buried, choices I had justified, moments I had never forgiven myself for. But the light didn't accuse. It didn't condemn. It simply held space, as if to say, "You're ready now." And strangely, I was. I didn't run from the memories. I let them rise. I let them breathe. One morning, before anyone else in the house had stirred, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. The steam curled upward like a spirit, and I stared at it, lost in the way it danced. I began to think about all the ways I had betrayed myself over the years. The times I had smiled to keep the peace when I should have spoken. The times I had withheld kindness from others out of fear or pride. The apologies I had never offered. The tears I had never allowed myself to shed. And again, the light didn't scold me. It witnessed me, it welcomed me, it stayed. There was a moment during my near-death experience that I had never spoken aloud, not even to my wife. It was too intimate, too sacred. After the light had entered me, after the city had opened itself like a living heart, there was a pause, a moment of stillness where time didn't exist and space didn't matter. And in that moment, the light didn't speak, but it showed me. It showed me my life. Not in sequence, not in scenes, but in truth. I felt the impact I'd had on others, not just what I remembered doing, but how I had made them feel. I felt the sting of my impatience, the heaviness of my absence, the echo of words I had carelessly spoken. But I also felt the warmth of every moment I had loved sincerely, the laughter I had shared, the gentle touch of compassion I had offered even without realizing its importance. It was as if the light had gathered every detail of my life and offered it back to me, not to punish, but to clarify. It was the first time I had ever truly seen myself without distortion. And instead of shame, I felt compassion, not just for others, but for me. For the boy who had grown up believing he needed to be strong at all costs. For the man who had spent so many years outrunning his own softness. In that space between death and life, I forgave myself in a way I didn't know I needed. And then almost immediately the city had appeared, as if forgiveness had unlocked the final gate. I hadn't understood it at the time, but now I do. The near-death experience wasn't just a spiritual journey, it was an unveiling. The light hadn't shown me what was wrong with me. It had shown me what was real. And now, even back in this world, that truth still burned quietly beneath my skin. I began writing letters I never intended to send. To my father who had passed before I could truly thank him. To an old friend I had cut off during a season of pride. Even to my younger self, the boy who felt invisible, who carried shame he didn't know how to name. I wrote with honesty, with tenderness. I wasn't trying to fix the past. I was trying to honor it. I was trying to listen to what the light had whispered, that all parts of me deserved to be seen. I found myself crying more easily, not out of sorrow, out of release. I laughed more deeply, not because life had become easier, but because it had become truer. I said I love you more often and meant it each time. The masks I used to wear, busyness, sarcasm, control, they no longer fit. They slid off like dry bark, revealing something soft and green beneath. I wasn't growing back, I was growing differently. Even when I returned to work, people noticed. I wasn't louder, I was lighter. I listened more, I judged less. I no longer filled silence with noise. I allowed it to stretch, because I knew deep in my bones that silence wasn't empty. It was sacred. The hill, the city, the light. They never left me. They live in how I see now, in how I forgive, in how I pause before reacting, in how I wash dishes or look at the sky or listen to someone without planning my reply. The near-death experience wasn't an interruption, it was an invitation. Not to die, but to live, fully, honestly, softly. So now I walk slower. I notice more. I pay attention to the way sunlight hits a bowl, to the way people sigh when they don't think anyone is watching, to the strange beauty of dust floating in afternoon light. And I trust now more than ever that the divine doesn't live in distant realms. It lives in small things, in real things, in this life. And every time I feel the pull to escape, to prove to perform, I return to that place inside me where the light still waits. And I remember I don't have to search for heaven, I just have to stay present enough to see it. It didn't arrive with a vision or a voice. The realization came quietly, almost unnoticeably, while I was standing in the backyard trimming a vine that had grown wild along the fence. The air was still. The sky was heavy with clouds. A bird fluttered from the hedges, and in the space it left behind, a stillness settled not just around me, but inside me. I put the shears down slowly and stood upright, listening not to sound, but to silence. And in that moment, I knew I was no longer afraid to die. There was no fanfare to the truth. Just a soft, undeniable peace. Death was no longer a shadow hiding at the edge of my thoughts. It wasn't a thief, a punishment, or a finish line. It was a return, a rejoining. And instead of fearing it, I now understood it as a threshold that had already opened to me once before. My near-death experience didn't just show me what lay beyond, it taught me how to be here, in this body, in this moment, without needing to escape. Strangely, the absence of fear didn't make me reckless. It made me more tender with everything. I noticed the way rain touched the windows, like it was asking permission to come inside. I watched the way my wife's eyes softened when she looked at me, not because she was worried, but because she finally knew I was truly present. I felt how each breath filled not just my lungs, but the invisible space I once thought was empty. I didn't want to die, not because I feared what waited on the other side, but because I had finally learned how to live on this one. I started waking up early, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to witness the day before the world crowded in. I sat at the table with coffee while the light shifted through the kitchen like a slow golden tide. I watched how the rim of my daughter's cereal bowl caught the sun, how the steam from my mug curled into the still air. I wasn't chasing moments, I was letting them arrive. Each one felt like a small miracle, a quiet arrival, a reminder that life isn't something to win, it's something to honor. I no longer measured my days by tasks completed. I measured them by how deeply I noticed. When I spoke, I no longer filled the silence with filler words. When I listened, I didn't interrupt. When I walked, I wasn't going somewhere, I was somewhere. The shift was subtle, but it rewired everything. I wasn't performing anymore. I wasn't maintaining an image or a role or a mask. I was just here fully and finally here. And the people around me could feel it. My wife smiled more often. My kids lingered longer in conversation. Even strangers in checkout lines seemed to hold my gaze an extra second. Not because I had changed physically, but because presence radiates in a way the eyes can't fake. One afternoon, I found myself walking through a cemetery. I wasn't visiting anyone. I had just seen the gate and turned in without thinking. The grass was perfectly cut. The headstones stood like open books. There was no music, no wind, just the hum of silence layered over names and dates. I walked slowly, reading the words people chose to leave behind. Some were poetic, some were plain. All of them were final, and yet not a single one of them felt truly gone. I looked at the names and I thought you were here, and somehow you still are. I stood there for a long time and realized that my fear of death had never really been about death itself. It had been about disappearance, about not mattering, about being erased. But now, after my near-death experience, I know better. Consciousness doesn't end, it expands. What we are isn't confined to flesh or time. The body stops, but the soul continues. Memory becomes presence. The ones we love don't vanish, they change address. The city I saw wasn't a fantasy. The light wasn't a hallucination. And the love I felt was not a story I told myself to feel safe. It was the most honest thing I've ever known. When people ask me now what it was like to die, I didn't flinch. I told them the truth. Dying wasn't the miracle. Coming back was. Because I didn't just return to life, I returned awake. And the real gift wasn't survival, it was sight. Sight that allowed me to see suffering not as punishment, but as a place where the light enters. Sight that allowed me to stop turning away from the hard parts of life and instead move closer. I didn't quote scripture, I didn't lecture, I didn't give advice unless asked. What I offered was something quieter. I stayed, I listened. I held hands when words wouldn't reach. Because now I knew that presence is the medicine. That silence isn't empty, it's sacred. That pain isn't failure, it's transformation. Sometimes at night I stood in the hallway just watching my children sleep, their chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm, their dreams humming softly beneath their skin. I didn't interrupt. I didn't touch them. I simply watched. And inside me I whispered, thank you, not to a God in the clouds, not to the universe, in abstraction, but to life itself, for letting me stay, for letting me return, for giving me another chance to witness wonder. I kept the sketch of the city in my wallet, folded neatly, edges fraying. I didn't take it out often. I just liked knowing it was there, a quiet anchor, a map that no one else could read but me. I had seen the veil, I had stepped through it, and I had come back not to tell a story, but to live a different one. I had died, and I had returned. But the real miracle was this: I had awakened. Not long after I returned to the rhythms of daily life, the light inside me began to tug at something I had long buried. It wasn't dramatic. It came in quiet waves, memories, moments, faces. People I had walked away from. Words I should have said but didn't. Kindness I withheld. I didn't need to be told what to do. The near-death experience had already shown me. That city, that silence, that beam of love. It hadn't judged me, but it had revealed everything. And what it revealed was this: I had been careless with my heart, and even more so with the hearts of others. It began with my brother. We hadn't spoken in 6 years, a falling out over something stupid, something prideful. And for those 6 years, I carried the silence between us like a badge of who was right. But now that silence felt heavy, hollow, untrue. I sat with my phone in my hand for almost an hour before calling him. When he picked up, his voice cracked. I didn't prepare a speech. I didn't explain or defend. I just said I saw something when I died, and it made me realize I want you in my life again. He didn't say much, just me too. And somehow that was enough. That call opened the floodgates. I began reaching out to people I had once distanced myself from, not to fix anything, but to tell the truth. To tell them I had thought of them, that I was sorry, that I wished I had done better. Some replied with confusion, some with forgiveness. A few didn't respond at all, but that wasn't the point. The point was to unchain my heart from old stories, to walk back through every doorway I had closed and at least knock once before walking away for good. The near-death experience had shown me that nothing is wasted, not a smile, not a sigh, not a single word left unspoken. And now I felt the weight of everything I had left unsaid, so I started saying it. To my wife, I said thank you, not for the big things, but for the small ones. I never noticed the way she always made my side of the bed first, the way she pressed her cheek to my chest before falling asleep. To my children, I said I was proud, not just of what they did, but of who they were when no one was watching. To my mother, I said I understood, that I finally saw her not just as a parent, but as a person who had tried her best with what she had. One night alone in the garage, I found an old photo box I hadn't touched in years. I sat cross-legged on the cold floor, sifting through images of the past vacations, birthdays, forgotten friends. I stopped at a picture of me holding my first daughter hours after she was born. My face looked younger, stronger, but behind the smile I could see the fear of being too soft, of not knowing how to love the right way. I stared at that version of myself and whispered, "You did better than you thought." The tears came without warning. I didn't resist them. I let them fall slow and warm like baptism. In that moment, I wasn't grieving. I was releasing, letting go of all the armor I had worn as protection from pain that had already happened. I saw with absolute clarity that most of the harm I had done came not from malice, but from fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of rejection, fear of being seen as weak. But the near-death experience had stripped all that away. When you've stood in front of the divine, when you've been seen completely and loved anyway, there's no point in pretending. That's the strange gift no one tells you about dying. It burns away everything false, not just in the moment, but afterward too. You can't go back to being numb. You can't play small just to fit in. You can't unsee what the light has shown you. And the light had shown me this love must be spoken, not assumed. Grace must be given, not earned. And pain must be faced, not feared. In the weeks that followed, I had conversations I never thought I'd have. I told an old friend I had envied him more than I ever admitted, and that I was sorry for pushing him away. I apologized to a former coworker for being dismissive in meetings, not because I was cruel, but because I was insecure. I even wrote a letter to someone who had hurt me deeply years ago, not to reconcile, but to let go. I told them I had forgiven them, and I meant it. And as I did these things, something changed inside me. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, like the quiet shift of wind before the trees move. I felt lighter, cleaner, like my soul had stopped holding its breath. That's the thing about near-death experiences, they don't just show you heaven. They show you everything that's keeping you from it right now. And most of the time, it's not fate or failure or other people. It's you. It's your walls, your silence, your refusal to soften. But once you've crossed over, once you've felt that kind of love, you can't keep living armored. It feels like lying. So now when I love someone, I tell them. When I forgive someone, I say it out loud. When I cry, I let it be seen. I don't hold back anymore, not because I'm fearless, but because I've realized what's truly worth fearing: dying with things unsaid, dying with love withheld, dying without ever having really shown up. I don't know how long I'll be here. None of us do. But I do know this: as long as I'm breathing, I will not let pride keep me from connection. I will not let ego win the war against softness. And I will not wait for another near-death experience to remind me that this life is fragile, sacred, and too short for silence. I died once, and the light didn't judge me. It simply showed me the truth and loved me anyway. And now, every day that I wake up, I try to do the same. There was no celebration for my rebirth, no cakes, no candles, no one sang a song or sent flowers. That's the thing about a near-death experience: no one knows you've been born again unless you tell them. And even then, they rarely understand. I came back into this world with the same name, same body, same address. But I wasn't the same, not even close. The man I had been before the light touched me had died in silence. And the one who returned was quieter, but more alive than he had ever been. This second life didn't start with clarity. It started with confusion. Because no one prepares you for how strange the world feels after a near-death experience. You expect it to be familiar. You expect to slip back into your routines like an old pair of shoes, but they no longer fit. Everything feels foreign, slightly out of tune. You find yourself standing in front of a refrigerator wondering why your heart aches over a bottle of milk. You drive to the store and suddenly pull over, overcome by the way sunlight touches the dashboard. You walk into your workplace and feel like you're watching a play where you used to be the lead, but now feel like a stranger in the background. And the hardest part, no one else sees it. They see you walking, talking, healing, so they assume you're back. But you're not. You're somewhere between. You're living in the tension between the person you used to be and the one you're slowly becoming. And that liminal space, that awkward, sacred middle ground, is where your second life begins. I started noticing that I wasn't reacting the same way I used to. Things that once made me angry now made me quiet. Things that used to feel urgent now felt distant. I stopped rushing, I stopped proving. I stopped trying to earn something I couldn't name. Instead, I watched. I listened. I let things pass through me instead of sticking to me. It wasn't detachment, it was presence. I was finally learning how to be in the world without letting the world devour me. But that didn't mean it was easy. There were days I felt unbearably alone, not because I lacked love, but because I lacked language. How do you explain that you died, met something sacred, and came back with an ache to live differently? How do you tell people that their small talk feels like static when your soul is craving symphonies? I smiled. I nodded. I participated. But deep down, I was yearning for depth, for real, for stillness. That's when I started walking. Every morning before sunrise, I'd leave the house and wander through the neighborhood as if retracing steps from another life. The streets were quiet, the sky always different. Some days the clouds hung low and gray. Other mornings the stars stayed just a little longer, like they knew I needed the company. I didn't walk for exercise, I walked to remember. The near-death experience had left a trail of breadcrumbs in my chest, and those walks helped me follow them back to the light I'd felt. And somewhere along those early morning walks, I began to feel something else, peace. Not the kind people talk about on coffee mugs. I mean the kind that sits in your bones, the kind that doesn't depend on circumstances. It wasn't loud, it wasn't euphoric, it was subtle, gentle, like someone holding your hand in a dark room without saying a word. That's when I understood the second life wasn't about doing more, it was about being more open, more honest, more present. I didn't need to reinvent my life. I needed to re-inhabit it fully, from the inside out. I began to see God in the ordinary, divinity in the dust, grace in the pause before a reply, heaven in the space between two breaths. My near-death experience didn't give me a destination. It gave me a new lens. And through it, everything was sacred, especially the things I used to overlook. Like the way my son absent-mindedly played with the frayed end of a couch cushion while telling me a story. Or the way my wife unconsciously hummed the same tune while folding laundry. Or the way the wind moved through a pine tree like a memory you didn't know you still carried. Those little things became my cathedral. And every time I noticed one, it felt like the city from my near-death experience was calling again. Not with trumpets or visions, but with quiet invitations to stay awake. I used to think purpose was something loud, something public, something you chased. Now I know purpose is how you hold a moment, how you treat the people you pass, how you breathe when no one's watching. The second birth didn't make me more successful. It made me more sensitive. And strangely, that became my strength. Now when someone shares their pain with me, I don't rush to fix it. I sit in it with them. When someone tells me they're tired, I don't offer advice. I offer presence. Because I've seen the other side, and I know no one needs to be saved. They need to be seen, just like I was, just like the light saw me. The second life I live isn't perfect. I still forget. I still get impatient. I still drift back into the old habits sometimes. But the difference now is I catch myself. I return faster. I soften sooner. I forgive easier. I'm no longer trying to build a life that looks good from the outside. I'm building one that feels true on the inside. And that's the kind of life worth dying for. Or better yet, worth waking up for again and again every single day. After a while, people stopped asking about what happened. The story of my near-death experience became old news. It had made the rounds through text messages, coffee shop whispers, and quiet conversations over dinner. He almost died, they'd say. Appendix rupture, a miracle he made it. And then they moved on, as they should, because life moves, and people need to return to their own storms. But I didn't move on. I couldn't. Something had taken root in me, something quiet and unshakable. My near-death experience hadn't just been a passing event. It had been a rebirth, not just of my body, but of my perception. And that rebirth didn't end when the machines were unplugged or when I walked out of the hospital. It continued every single day in silence. The world kept spinning around me. Cars filled the streets, phones buzzed, news cycled. But my inner world had slowed down to the pace of breath. I began to live like someone carrying a glass bowl filled to the brim with light every step, cautious, deliberate, sacred. Not because I was afraid of dropping it, but because I had finally understood its value. There were days when I felt like the only one who could still hear the music. Like I'd returned from another country where the sky hummed and the grass breathed, but no one here remembered the language. I'd sit in a cafe and watch people scroll their phones, order their drinks, rush out the door. I wanted to grab them to say, "Don't you know you're alive? You're here, and that's enough." But I didn't, because I knew I had been like them once too. I had walked past the miracle of a sunrise without even glancing up. Now I noticed everything. The way steam curled off a cup, the moment the wind changed direction, the shimmer on the skin of a sleeping child. And in those moments, the city I had seen during my near-death experience returned not physically, but in vibration, in sensation. I couldn't see its golden domes or hear its silent song, but I could feel it always just beneath the surface of this world, like a heartbeat you only hear when everything else goes quiet. The light hadn't left me, it had moved in. And the truth is, it didn't always feel beautiful. There were nights when the silence became so loud it echoed. There were mornings I felt adrift between dimensions, too awake to fully rejoin the world, too tethered to function like I used to. It wasn't depression, it wasn't confusion, it was a kind of spiritual homesickness, a longing not for escape, but for a deeper kind of presence I knew was possible because I had touched it. The near-death experience had carved out a space in me that nothing else could fill. It wasn't a hole, it was an altar. Sometimes I stood in doorways, pausing before I entered a room just to feel the light shift. I listened for moments, not with my ears, but with my soul. I looked into my wife's eyes longer. I ran my fingers over the grain of wood on our kitchen table like it was holy. I learned to live inside each second, not as a passing moment, but as a living being that arrived to meet me. And in that attention, I found something extraordinary. Stillness wasn't the absence of movement, it was the presence of everything. That's the deepest lesson my near-death experience gave me, that the divine isn't hidden. It's ignored, it's drowned out by noise and speed and urgency, but it's here, always here, in the pause before laughter, in the breath between words, in the gentle way dusk arrives without asking for applause. And in that awareness, I found a new kind of faith, not in religion, not in rules, but in relationship with the mystery, with the quiet intelligence behind existence. I didn't need certainty. I had memory, and that memory was enough. I remembered how the light had looked at me, not with eyes, but with total knowing. I remembered how it had shown me everything I had ever been and still chose to hold me in love. That kind of mercy rewrites you. And so I began to walk differently in the world. I no longer needed to be impressive. I no longer needed to be right. I no longer chased the illusion of being important. I began to care more about being real. Not dramatic, not enlightened, just real. Soft where I used to be hard. Open where I used to be guarded. Quiet where I used to fill the air. There was a morning when I sat on the back porch and watched a single leaf fall. It spun slowly, lazily, and when it landed, something inside me said, "This is enough. That's it. That's the lesson. To fall gently, to rest where you land, to trust the unseen wind. And now, even when life gets messy, I don't panic. I return. Not to an idea, but to a sensation. The one I felt during the near-death experience when I was weightless, timeless, fully held. I breathe slower. I speak more kindly. I forgive sooner. I know now that love isn't something you give when someone deserves it. Love is what you are when you remember who you've always been. The light didn't save me from dying. It taught me how to live. And not just once, but every day after. For a long time, I believed the light I saw in my near-death experience was meant only for me. A sacred moment gifted by something greater. A personal encounter I wasn't supposed to share, just quietly cherish. But I was wrong. The longer I carried it, the more I realized this light was never mine to keep. It was entrusted to me. It was meant to ripple out, not to stay locked in my chest. My return from death wasn't just survival, it was assignment. I came back with a responsibility, one I couldn't ignore. The world around me looked the same when I returned. The walls, the streets, the faces hadn't changed, but I had. And the more I tried to re-enter my old life, the more I felt like a ghost in my own story. You don't come back from a near-death experience and simply pick up where you left off, because where you left off no longer exists. You're no longer the person who lived that life. You've crossed through something final, and yet you're asked to keep living. And so you walk through familiar places as a different being. You smile when people talk, but you're listening to something beneath their words. You carry an awareness no one else can see. Not superiority, just softness. A quiet reverence for everything. I started noticing the smallest things. The pause between heartbeats. The sound of wind brushing against curtains. The way my daughter absent-mindedly braided a thread on her sleeve. These weren't random details. They were holy, because everything became holy after the near-death experience. Nothing was too small to matter. I could no longer separate the sacred from the ordinary. And maybe that's the whole point. I was never meant to. Death stripped everything down to its truth. I saw myself, not my achievements or titles, but the energy I had carried. The wounds I had inflicted. The love I had withheld. But also the love I had given when no one saw. The forgiveness I had offered even when I was still hurting. And the light met it all with absolute presence. No judgment, no shame, only clarity and mercy. That's what changed me forever. The realization that love isn't something you earn. It's something you return to. It's something you remember. The near-death experience didn't show me a place. It showed me a reality that had always been here, just hidden by noise and fear. I came back with silence in my bones. Not the kind that empties, but the kind that fills. The kind that listens instead of speaks. That holds space instead of hurrying to fix. And in that silence, I saw people more clearly than ever. I saw how hungry we all are for connection, for meaning, for stillness. We pretend we want answers, but really we just want to feel held. We want someone to say, "You're not crazy. I've been there too, and there's light on the other side." I began showing up differently, not with wisdom, but with presence. I stopped performing, I stopped proving, I started just being. When someone cried, I didn't rush to console, I sat beside them in their pain. When someone got angry, I didn't defend, I stayed open. The near-death experience taught me the rarest form of love is witnessing without trying to control. And so I became a witness of beauty, of sorrow, of transformation. And that was when it hit me, I didn't return for myself. I returned for others. I returned to remind, to point gently, not preach. To say in my own way, there's more than this. There's more in this. We are not just bodies. We are not our pain. We are not what happened to us. We are light in form, memory in motion, love wrapped in skin. And even when we forget, especially when we forget, life keeps trying to remind us. Through heartbreak, through beauty, through strange coincidences and soft moments, and people who show up when we least expect it. These are the echoes of the city, the one I saw in my near-death experience. It's not a fantasy, it's not a hallucination. It's a deeper reality that holds us even now. I carry it in my breath, in the way I hold my child, in how I say thank you to the trees, in how I forgive myself at night for all the ways I still fall short. Because the light didn't ask me to be perfect. It asked me to be present, and presence is what I offer now, to my family, to strangers, to this moment, to you. I don't need to die again to know what matters. I've already seen, and now I remember. Every time I choose love over fear, stillness over reaction, truth over comfort, that's the real return. That's the miracle. Not that I survived, but that I woke up. And I'm still waking up day after day, breath after breath, deeper and deeper into this beautiful, fleeting, sacred life. I didn't come back to tell you what to believe. I came back to show you what's possible when you remember who you are. That was the near-death experience of Adrian Quinn, a man who didn't just survive death but awakened to life in a way few ever do. His story is not merely about what waits on the other side, but about how we choose to live on this side, more present, more honest, more alive. He returned carrying a truth many forget, that the veil between heaven and earth is thinner than we think, and the sacred isn't hiding in far-off realms. It's here, in breath, in silence, in the way we hold each other without needing words. Adrian's journey reminds us that you don't have to flatline to wake up. You don't need a heartbeat to restart your life. Sometimes all it takes is remembering who you truly are and choosing to live like it matters. If this story moved you, if it stirred something forgotten in your soul, let it be more than just a passing feeling. Let it stay. Let it soften you. Let it guide how you see the world from this moment forward. And if you're ready to walk this path with us to explore more stories that pierce the noise and speak to the deepest part of who you are, then join our community. Subscribe to the channel, give this video a like to help the message reach someone who needs it, and share it with a soul that might be quietly searching. We don't just tell stories here, we lift the veil, one experience at a time, one soul at a time. This isn't just content, this is remembrance. And if you're still listening, maybe you're one of the ones meant to carry the light.